Welcome to Module 10 of the Introduction to Organic Dairy Production. This module is on the organic transition and certification process. My name is Sarah Flack, and I'm a specialist in organic grass-based livestock production systems and organic certification. The goals for this module is to help you gain an understanding of the organic dairy certification and transition process. Specifically, what we're going to look at is the dairy transition process for land and livestock, the certification process, the role of the organic certifier and the organic inspector, and how or if the organic certifier will grant certification to the farm. What we will cover in this module is the organic transition process, and then the certification process for first-time applicants, including the process of choosing an organic certifier, the application process, the certification review of the application by the certifier, the on-site inspection of the farm, and then the certification decision-making process, which will either grant certification or not grant certification to the farm. We'll also discuss certification costs, and then for renewal applicants who have already been certified, we'll discuss the renewal process, the OSP, which stands for the Organic System Plan, and a brief overview of the records. There are 2 required readings for this module, and then 1 article on organic dairy certification, which was assigned required reading for Module 2, which might be useful to reread for this module. So why is it necessary to get organic certification? This is a review of some of the information we covered in Module 2. Basically, all organic operations are required to be certified unless they are specifically exempt from certification requirements. In addition, organic milk buyers will require organic certification from the farm before they will start picking up the milk and paying the farmer for the organic milk. Just an important note here is that just getting certified organic does not guarantee that there will be an organic milk buyer that will be willing to buy the milk from the farm once they're certified. So it's very important that farmers secure a contract with an organic milk buyer before they start the organic transition process. The organic transition process can be quite expensive, so it's essential to have that contract before beginning to spend the money on the transition. So just to summarize the organic transition process, you should refer to Module 2 and also the full version of the National Organic Standards for the detail on the transition requirements. But generally, land requires a 3-year organic transition before organic crops can be produced, and dairy animals require a full 12 months of organic feed and organic management before they can be certified. The transition may include significant costs for farms, including the cost of purchasing organic feed for the full 12 months prior to being able to be paid the organic milk price. And there may be additional infrastructure costs to meet the organic housing, outdoor access, and pasture requirements. Transition process also requires record keeping and a thorough understanding of the organic standards and the organic certification process. So now looking in more detail at the land transition. The land transition applies to all crops, which include pasture. It requires that there be a minimum of 3 years with no application of any prohibited materials. It requires that all of the fields have distinct, defined boundaries, and that the farm has proactive steps planned out to prevent any contamination from adjoining land uses. The transition also requires implementation of an OSP, which is an Organic System Plan, with proactive fertility management systems described, as well as conservation measures and environmentally sound management of manure, weed, disease, and pests. It also requires a monitoring system of the operations management practices to assure that the farm is in compliance with the organic standards and managing as stated in their organic system plan. So looking at more of the land transition requirements, during the transition, the farms can use natural inputs or approved synthetic materials, which are on the national list, but they first must use management practices to prevent any weed or pest problems. And then after they've used those management practices to prevent those, if those practices fail, then they can use these allowed inputs for control of pests and weeds. Prohibited substance use is not allowed. It is also not allowed to use GMOs or genetically modified organisms, and sewage sludge and irradiation are also prohibited. Farmers can't use any seeds which have been treated with prohibited synthetic materials, and farms must maintain or improve the physical, chemical, and biological condition of the soil, and farms must minimize soil erosion. The standards also require that soil fertility management must be done in a way that does not contaminate crops, soils, or water. And very importantly, throughout the transition process, farms must keep records so that they can later verify that they were following the organic standards during the transition process. So now looking at the livestock transition process, organic management is required to occur from the last third of gestation for slaughter stock, so those are animals intended for meat production, and organic management is required from the second day of life after hatching for poultry. The transition is different for dairy cows, which requires a 1-year transition of 100% organic management and feed. And during that 1-year transition, and only during that 1-year livestock transition, there is an allowance for farm-raised third-year transitional feed. This is only when first converting a dairy farm and dairy herd to organic production, and only allows the use of transitional feed from their own farm. Organic management is then required for dairy animals from the last third of gestation once an operation has converted to organic. All of the feed and all of the feed supplements need to be approved. All of the agricultural ingredients in any of the feed supplements must be certified organic. Continuing on with the organic standards and transition process, there needs to be an organic system plan, which is also referred to as the application by many certifiers and farmers. There needs to be a monitoring system to keep track of the management practices and assure that the farm is in compliance with the organic standards and operating according to their plan in the organic system plan. The organic standards requirement for livestock requires outdoor access when the weather is suitable, and it requires pasture access during the grazing season. There are exemptions to outdoor access and pasture requirements. For ruminants, during the grazing season, at least 30% of their dry matter intake needs to come from pasture. There's a requirement that there be a pasture plan for farms which have ruminants. Antibiotics, growth hormones, and genetically modified organisms are prohibited. And farms must have a preventative health care practice and plan. Vaccines, biologics, and certain excipients are allowed in livestock medications. Parasiticides are prohibited in slaughter stock, and they are highly regulated for use in dairy and breeder stock. And a very important thing to know about the healthcare requirements for organic and transitioning herds is that the farm is not allowed to withhold medical treatment in order to preserve an animal's organic status. But once an animal is treated with a prohibited material, it can no longer be used or sold as organic. So there are many organic certifiers who are accredited by the USDA National Organic Program, and farms get to choose the certifier that they want to use to go through the certification process for their farm. It's important for farms to choose that certifier early during the transition process so that they can plan out the transition and certification timeline. Make sure that they have the correct record-keeping system set up, and then start the process of filling out the application and submitting their organic system plan to the certifier. There's a complete list of all of the accredited certification agencies on the NOP website. Each organic certification agency is certifying to the same national organic standards, and each of those certifiers must be accredited by the National Organic Program. Certifiers have different fee structures, offer somewhat different services, and have slightly different documentation requirements and templates. In addition, some certifiers may only certify in specific geographic areas of the country, or they may specialize in a particular type of operation. So it's important to choose a certifier which best meets the need of the particular farm requesting certification. And again, it's very important to contact the certifier early in the transition process to make sure that the transition and certification happens on the timeline that the farm requires. So we're now going to go into the National Organic Program standards in Subpart E on the certification process. And there is not enough time to go through these in thorough detail, so this is just going to be an overview of these sections of the National Organic Standards, and you should refer to the full rule for all of the detail. We're going to first look at section 205-400, which is the general requirements for certification. This requires that persons seeking to receive or maintain organic certification must comply with the organic standards, must establish, implement, and annually update an organic system plan, or OSP. They must be inspected annually and maintain records for at least 5 years and pay the annual application and certification fees. Section 205-401 goes into more detail about the submission of the OSP and the certification fees. And section 205-402 describes how the certifier reviews the application or OSP once it has been submitted by the farmer. And then the certifier, after that review process, informs the applicant if the application is complete. And if the application is complete and the certifier feels that they have all of the information that they need, then they will then send that certification file to an organic inspector, and that inspector will schedule the inspection and go out to the farm and do the actual on-site inspection. The applicant at any point in this process may withdraw their application. On-site inspections are done at some point during, generally within 6 months of the application being received. In addition to the annually scheduled organic inspection that occurs on site, there may also be unannounced inspections, also known as surprise inspections. Section 205-402 on the on-site inspection process states that the inspector must be knowledgeable about the type of operation that they're inspecting, and that the job of the inspector during this process is to verify that the farm is complying with the organic standards and is following the organic system plan and is not using any prohibited materials. At the end of the on-site inspection, the inspector must conduct an exit interview, and during that exit interview, the inspector is going to be letting the farmer know what the potential noncompliances may be. But also the inspector should be very clear with the farmer that the inspector is not making the certification decision. The certification decision is only made by the certifier, and the inspector's job is just to conduct the inspection and then let the farmer know in the exit interview process what these potential noncompliances may be. But that the farm should then wait to receive notification from the certifier about those potential noncompliances. After the inspection and exit interview process, the certifier will give a copy of the inspection report to the farm. So now we're going to look at 205-404, which is the actual process of granting certification. So this occurs after the certifier has received the inspection report from the inspector. At that point, the certification review specialist will look at the report and the organic system plan and all of the other material sent in by the inspector and by the farmer, and will determine if the operation is in compliance. And if they are, they will grant certification. Some of the criteria that the certifier is looking at when they decide whether the farm should get certified or not is whether the farm is in compliance with the organic standards, whether the farm is being managed according to their OSP that they filled out. And it's also in this section described that once an operation is certified, that operation will remain certified until they are suspended or their certification is revoked by the certifier, or until that farm voluntarily withdraws and surrenders their certification. 205-405 describes the denial of certification process for new applicants. Basically, if the farm does not comply with the organic standards, the certifier must notify the farm of each of the noncompliance issues and give them a deadline to either submit a rebuttal or submit a corrective action to those noncompliances. And the applicant can choose whether they want to correct these issues or whether they want to rebut them and say that they really are not noncompliances and explain why. The certifier will issue a notice of denial of certification to a new applicant if the certifier decides that correction of the noncompliances is not possible, or if the applicant simply fails to respond to the notice of noncompliance. So if they receive a noncompliance letter and don't do anything at all, they will have their certification denied. And the certifier may also deny certification if they feel like the corrective action that was submitted is just not sufficient. Certification can also be denied for an operation that is willfully making false statements or misrepresenting the operation. So section 205-406 applies to renewal applicants who are reapplying for continued organic certification. So each year, each certified farm or processor has to resubmit an updated organic system plan and pay their renewal certification fees. They get another annual organic inspection on site. And then it's a similar process in that if the farm is not complying with the organic standards, the certifier must notify them of each noncompliance and give them a deadline to submit a rebuttal or corrective action. And again, the applicant can choose to correct it or rebut the noncompliance. And then again, with these continuing renewal certifications, the certifier has to issue a notice of denial of certification if the operation is not correcting the noncompliance. And that denial of certification, or in this case, revocation of certification or suspension of certification, needs to include the reasons for the proposed revocation, the proposed effective date, and then the operation's right to appeal or to request mediation. And ideally, the farmer ends up, when they have their renewal inspection, without any major noncompliances, and they are issued a notice of certification, which is simply receiving their renewal organic certificate in the mail with a letter that says you are compliant with the organic standards. But there are frequently, particularly with new applicants and farms that have only been certified for a couple of years, there will often be these minor or correctable noncompliances that will take a certain amount of correspondence back and forth between the certifier and the farm to make sure that all of the potential noncompliances have been corrected. So here's a summary of what we just went through, this organic certification process. The first step is the application by the farm and the development of the organic system plan, or OSP. The second step is the farm then implements the organic system plan. The third step is that the certifier is reviewing the application and the organic system plan. And then If all of the material is complete, the certifier will give that certification file to an organic inspector, and the on-site inspection of the operation will occur. The inspection report will be written by the inspector and sent back to the certifying agent. And step 5 is that the certifying agent will review the inspection report and all of the other materials in the file. And step 6 is this decision-making process by the certifier. There are some additional sections in the organic standards that we've not gone into in any detail, but I just wanted to mention that certifiers are also authorized to investigate complaints. They may do unannounced or surprise inspections, and they can also take samples to test for prohibited substances. There is a cost of organic certification, and different certifiers have different certification fees. So when choosing a certifier, this is one of the things that farmers should look at, is what the fees are and how the fees schedules are structured differently from one certifier to another. So each year the farms all have to pay an annual certification fee, and it's important to note that the cost for new applicants may be higher in that first year because they generally require more time by the certifier to go through the certification process. Some certifiers charge a user fee, which is based on a percentage of annual gross sales of organic product. And then there may be some additional expense charged directly to the farm for the inspection costs or the travel expense for the inspector getting to the farm. Some types of certified operations, such as dairy farms or processors, which are more complicated inspections, may pay higher fees than others. And at this time, there are currently still some funds available through the USDA in some areas to help with the cost of certification. So just reviewing the process to stay certified once a farm has its organic certification, each year they need to fill out the OSP, they need to keep records, and be prepared for the next inspection, which may be scheduled or may be unannounced. And each year they need to go through this renewal application process. So now let's look in a little bit more detail what goes into the Organic System Plan, or OSP. The OSP is basically a description of how the farm will be managed and all of the materials that will be used. More specifically, it's a farm management plan for all aspects of the farm, and it should also include a list of all of the materials and inputs which are being used and may be used in the coming year. And so this is very important, and it requires that all of the livestock healthcare materials that might be used be listed. All of the soil fertility or pest or weed control materials needs to be listed in here. All of the milk house cleaners and milking sanitizers need to be listed in here. Basically everything that the farm might use on the farm needs to be listed in the OSP ahead of time so that it can be approved by the certifier prior to use. The OSP also includes a description of the self-monitoring systems that they need to have in place. It should include a description of the type of records or the record-keeping systems that will be used, and a description of the management system to prevent commingling with non-organic crops or animals, and prevention of contamination by prohibited materials. So for example, this would be descriptions of things like buffers in fields that adjoin non-organically managed crops. And then the OSP also needs to include any additional information that the certifier deems necessary. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some detailed descriptions of the types of records that farmers may typically be required to keep. And this is directly coming from one of the record-keeping resources that is on the NOP website. And this record-keeping instruction article lists all of this information in it. So we'll first look at the types of records that organic crop producers might be required to keep. And this is going to cover the types of records that both vegetable crop producers and field crop producers, like the types of forage crops that dairy farmers may be keeping, as well as vegetable producers. So some of these records won't apply, but some of these will be things that organic dairy farmers should be keeping. So looking at the seeds, or in the case of vegetables, the transplants, this needs to include cover crop seed, and it also needs to include the pasture seeds. You need to make sure you keep all of the receipts of the seeds and invoices for when you buy the seeds. It's important to hang on to the seed packages and labels because you need to be able to prove to the certifier that the seeds were either organic, or if they were not organic, that they were non-GMO and that they were not treated with a prohibited material. Because a seed search is required if you buy non-organic seed, you need to keep a phone log or some sort of record of your attempts to get the organic seed before you then went ahead and got the non-organic seed. Sometimes this is an email log, sometimes it's a phone log just jotted down in a notebook. Then if you are buying a bunch of non-organic seed, additional documentation such as letters from the seed suppliers stating that they were unable to get you the organic seeds that you wanted, but that the seed that they then provided you with, though non-organic, was non-GMO and untreated. Then for the organic seeds, you'll want to get a copy of the organic certificate or invoices which state that they are certified organic seeds. If you're saving your own seed, you'll want to keep the harvest records showing that you indeed were the one who produced and harvested those seeds. If you are using seed treatments, such as an inoculant on a clover seed, it's important to make sure ahead of time that those inoculants are allowed for use on organic seeds, and then make sure you keep the treatment records, including the labels from the seed treatments. So now looking at the records that you might be keeping on field inputs, you'll want to keep records of the fertilizers and any other soil amendments that you're applying, including manure, compost, purchased fertilizers, synthetic micronutrients that are allowed. You'll want to keep records of the rates of those applications, the dates, where you spread them, and then also the product information. If you are using any pest control products, you'll want to keep those same sorts of application records, and including any spreader stickers that you might be using along with the main active ingredient in the pest control product. And then any crop production aids such as foliar sprays or other things like that. Again, keeping the records of when you used it, where you applied it, the amounts that you used, and then all of the information on the materials that you used themselves. And this is just another good time to remind ourselves that all of these inputs for fertilizers and pest and disease control, they all need to be pre-approved by the certifier before you use them, so you need to know for sure that they are allowed for use. Other types of records that you might be keeping include just a general farm activity log. This is often kept in a notebook or on a calendar, though more and more people are using computer programs for these sorts of things. That might include information such as grazing records, harvest records, manure spreading or compost spreading, planting, and sometimes even the livestock feeding records will get put in a generic farm activity log or calendar. You'll want to keep invoices for any contract services if you hire somebody to spread manure or do some mowing. And if you are hiring in contract workers to do that sort of thing and they're bringing in their own equipment, you'll want to make sure if they were using that equipment on non-organic crops before coming to your place, that they are making a record that they are cleaning out that equipment before they use it on your farm so that they aren't accidentally contaminating your organic crops with non-organic materials in the mower ahead of time. Then if you've got soil tests, you'll definitely want to keep copies of those for the inspector, particularly if you're using any micronutrients, because soil tests or some other type of test such as a tissue analysis is required before using the trace minerals. And then also records of the cultivation practices, if you're cultivating corn, weeding, planting dates. And then moving now into some of the other records required for crops. You'd want to, if you're adding new land, make sure that you have a crop history, which would be the land use of that field for the previous 3 years. And then you'd also want to have the material application records for the previous 3 years. And then if the new land that you're adding to your certification was previously certified, you'll want to get a copy of the organic certificate that covered that land during the previous years that it was certified. You'll definitely need maps of all of the fields, and those need to show the number of acres, the location of the fields, and most certifiers want to see the locations of any buffer areas to adjoining non-organic areas or power lines or roads indicated on the maps. There's also more detail on the mapping requirements for pasture, but we'll cover that in a little while. So more on crop records. There need to be harvest and storage records, particularly the harvest records. And this should include the quantities harvested and the dates harvested. And this would apply for grain that you're growing as well as hay crops or silage crops. Then if you're having other people do any of the harvesting for you, you'll want to have those custom harvest records, and you'll need some clean truck statements or clean equipment statements or affidavits if that custom harvest equipment is being used on non-organic crops prior to coming to your farm. Then if you're selling crops as organic, you'll want to have the sales records so that the inspector can look at your planting records, your input records, your harvest records, and your sales records, and be able to do a complete audit and see that the quantities that you're planting and growing make sense in terms of the quantities that you are then selling. If you're not selling the crops, you're just feeding them to your own dairy herd, then that same sort of audit of quantity will be done, but it will be compared to the quantity that you are then feeding to your dairy herd. So now we're going to shift gears and start to talk about some of the livestock records that most farms will want to keep. These will definitely include records of the herd, including things like breeding, calving, possibly even weaning records in some cases. You definitely want to keep all of your vet slips and vet records and any healthcare records of activities such as vaccination, dehorning, treating sick calves or sick cows. You'll want to keep invoices for purchased materials, and if you do buy any animals, you'll want to make sure that you have a detailed invoice for the purchase of the animal and a copy of the organic certificate for the animals that you're buying in. For feed records, anything that you're buying in obviously has to be certified organic, and so you'll need your invoices and the organic certificates to be able to clearly prove that the quantity of feed that you're buying in makes sense according to your ration and that it was all certified organic feed. You'll want to keep the grain invoices that show the weights of delivery if you are buying in grain from an organic grain company. You'll also want to keep the records and invoices for purchases of feed supplements and make sure that you have the bag labels and tags available so that the inspector or certifier can verify that all of the ingredients in your mineral supplements are allowed for use. Same thing with animal health care products. You'll want to make sure that that first of all, that all of them have been pre-approved by the certifier, and then you'll want to make sure that you keep the labels and purchase invoices as well as the records of their use. You do need to keep feeding records, and the detail on this is now included in the feeding section of the organic standards in 237, and this includes ration change records, which allow the calculations to be done to determine how much dry matter is coming from pasture. And this is one of the most common areas that we see farmers getting non-compliances, is that even if they're meeting the pasture rule, they may not be keeping good enough ration change records to prove that they are getting all of the dry matter that they are from pasture. So we'll go into some examples of these in a little while. And then again, you'll also want to have some harvest and possibly some inventory records for the feed that are grown right on the farm. So now looking at some of the animal health care records that should be kept. These includes culling records and death records, as well as purchase records for new animals, and calving records for new calves entering the herd. Healthcare or medication records, and these need to include both the routine activities such as vaccination and dehorning, as well as treating sick animals. So some of the records relating to the livestock living conditions and pasture include animal identification records, which is basically just a herd list, and this is done in a lot of different ways. Some people use a computer program such as DHIA or one of the other programs. They may be keeping paper records, but you basically need to have a list of all of the animals that are on the farm. Then also some types of grazing records need to be kept, and the most important part of the grazing records is to keep a record of when the grazing season begins, so when the different groups of animals start grazing, and then any exemptions, periods of time during the grazing season or interruptions in the grazing season when the animals are taken off of pasture, and then if they're put back on pasture, records of those dates, and then the end of the grazing season. So if those exemptions are for reasons such as inclement weather, like a flood or something like that, you'll want to keep a record of that. And then also keeping records of any temporary confinement periods. So if there's an ice storm in the winter and the cows are not able to go out into the barnyard, it may be a good idea to keep a record of that also. Some farmers also keep pasture rotation records, and honestly these are particularly helpful in doing pasture planning so that you can plan out ahead of time and know what your normal regrowth periods are at the different times of the year. So hopefully many of these records are being kept in a way that are really useful to you as a farmer and not just to meet the requirement of the organic record keeping standards. So then some of these records won't apply, obviously, if you're a dairy farmer, but the milk production records are often quite important. These will help be able to verify that the dry matter demand number that's being used is matching up to the current level of milk production. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and actually look at some real examples of records that are being kept on dairy farms around the country. And this is not going to be a comprehensive look at all the types of records. These are just some examples to help us look at the many different ways that farmers have figured out how to keep their records. So we'll start out with looking at crop record keeping systems. So the National Organic Program has a bunch of very helpful resources on their website, including the previous few slides that we went through, which is basically a listing of all of the different types of records that you may need to keep in order to meet the organic standards. But they also have a bunch of blank template forms which you may consider using as a way to keep some of your records. And in addition to being able to get these sorts of templates from the National Organic Program website, there are also quite a few certifiers who provide these types of record-keeping templates. So this is a really simple one. This is basically an activity calendar where in this case the farmer has written in that they have planted a cover crop on the 3rd of the month. But some of the other records which I commonly see kept on these sorts of simple wall calendars are manure spreading, where you can actually write in the number of loads of manure, even just in hash marks per day going on to the different fields. You can write in the number of bales harvested each day from different fields. And I've even seen people who are keeping their ration change records on their calendar, particularly if it's a relatively simple ration and it's not changed all that often. It's a lot of times easier just to put it right on the calendar instead of creating a whole separate record-keeping system for it. Here's the NOP template for keeping planting and harvest records. It gives you a column where you can list which field it is, what the crop is, what the planting date is, what the harvest date is, the amount harvested, and then if you're selling it, who the buyer was. And so in this case, this is a vegetable example in here, but for hay, this could be a hay field. It would give you the harvest dates, and then you would list the quantity of bales or the number of tons harvested on each of those dates. Here's the National Organic Program's example of an input material record. So this could be kept for applying compost or manure or any type of a fertilizer that's being spread. It could also be used if you're using some sort of a pest control or a disease control material on a field. So again, this allows you to record the date, where you put it, what the product was, where it came from, what it was used for, and then the column over second to the last column is an important one, and that's where you're writing in how you have verified this is allowed for use on an organic farm. And again, all of these materials need to be pre-approved by your certifier, but it's still a pretty good idea to write in certifier approved, or in this case, this material, the dipel being used, is OMRI listed. That's the Organic Material Review Institute, and they've approved this material for use. So here is an example record from the National Organic Program website for how you can keep track of non-organic seed and planting stock. And so this is where you make a list of the non-organic seeds that you used, where they came from, the reason you ended up using this non-organic seed instead of an organic one. So this is where you can write in your commercial availability search. So you can write in that you tried to contact 3 different seed suppliers and they all told you that this was not available in an organic form. And so you then got the non-organic one. And then the last column is where you can put in the information about the fact that it is a non-GMO seed and it was not treated. And of course, in addition to this information, you would also need to have the actual seed label and potentially the invoice also, so that you can really show that it was untreated and non-GMO. So this is another NOP example record that you can use for verifying that equipment that is also used on non-organic crops has been cleaned out before it's used on your organic crop. So this is a simple one where it's just the date, and then under equipment you could list combine or hay baler, and then you would write in the method of cleaning, which could be a purge where you send through some organic hay through the baler. And then the responsible party would be, you could sign off to say that you were the one who cleaned it, or if the person running the custom equipment cleaned it, then they would sign off in there. This is another example of a clean transport affidavit. There's many different types of these forms, and in this case this would be if deliveries of material coming to your farm such as grain are coming in trucks, which are also shared with non-organic grain transport. This would be a form that could be used to verify that the truck was indeed cleaned out before the organic grain got put in there. So you'll also need to keep track of what happens to crops in buffer areas if you're required to maintain buffers. And so this would be if you have a non-organic neighbor's field that is right next to your organic field, you may have a strip of hay or grain around the edge of your field that you need to harvest and then get rid of, since it is a non-organic crop. And so this is a way to keep the record of which field, which buffer was harvested, how much you harvested, and then where it was either sold to or given to, so that it doesn't accidentally get fed to your organic livestock. So now we're going to shift gears and look at some examples of livestock records. This is a template provided by Certifier. This is the Vermont Organic Farmer Certifications Organization's Animal ID template list that they give to farmers as one of the ways that they can keep their animal identification lists. And when a certifier gives you a template to use, it's not required that you use that template. If you're using a computer system or something that provides the equivalent information, you can go ahead and use that. This one is a very useful list because it gets you to list the ear tag or animal name or DHIA tag of each animal, what breed each one is, whether they're a calf or a heifer or a milker, the date that it was purchased or born on your farm, information on whether it was farm raised or purchased, and then this column on asking whether it qualifies for organic slaughter stock. This one also is often is quite confusing to people because the animals that qualify for organic milk production may not qualify for organic slaughter stock. And so if you're a dairy farmer and you would like to be able to sell some of your cull dairy animals for organic meat, you need to be tracking, in addition to all of the other information, you need to be tracking whether they qualify for organic slaughter stock. And so you need to know whether this animal was raised organically from the last third of it being gestated, and if it was ever treated with a material which would then make it prohibited for meat. And so that would be one of the parasiticides that are allowed for use in dairy animals. And then this record also has you keep track of whether any of them have a docked tail, so those would obviously be animals that were transitioned in. The date they got moved to the milking herd and placed under organic management, so this will be particularly important if you're transitioning animals in as you're starting up a dairy farm. And then the date that they leave the herd or are slaughtered or culled. A lot of people also use DHIA records or other types of computer records, particularly with larger herds, to be able to keep track of all of the animals on the farm. This is an example from Chico State University, their organic herd. All of their records are kept in various types of computer programs. This is an Excel system that they are keeping track of healthcare records in. So you've got the animal's ID, what the procedure was. In this case, there were some animals that were treated for high somatic cell count, some foot trimming, and some vaccination done. It shows the date that it was done on, what the treatment was for, and what the treatment material was with. And here is a purchased grain inventory. This is also being kept at Chico State University, so they're keeping track of the date, the quantity of grain that was delivered in both pounds and tons. And then in addition to this, obviously they'll also be saving their purchase invoices to verify that it was organic grain and which company it came from. So we're just looking at some of the Chico State grazing records now. In this case, this is the grazing record for a group of yearlings that were being grazed. And in the first column, they're indicating which pasture that they were in. In the second column, they're indicating how many head were in the group, and then the dates that they were going in and out of these various pastures. And then they're also keeping some notes in the left-hand column on when they were breeding them, when they were keeping them in the barn at night and out during the day, when grass growth started to slow down. And they could also put in information here about supplementing the feed with hay or something like that if needed. There are a lot of different ways being used to track the supplemental feeding during the grazing season, the so-called ration change records, which are basically records that are kept of each time there is a significant change in the amount of supplemental feed during the grazing season. This is a computerized system that Chico State is using for not just keeping track of what they're feeding, but actually doing the calculations for them. This is the National Organic Program's example worksheet, which also tracks exactly the same information. It keeps track of the amount of feed being fed, and then the new ration is recorded each time they're changing to a new ration, so you know how many days each of these different rations were fed. And then this is the same type of record being provided to producers by a certifier. In this case, this is MOFCA Certification Services, their ration change record. Again, it's the same information. It shows you the dates that each ration were fed and the amounts of each of the different types of feed in the ration. PCO, which is a Pennsylvania Certified Organic, has an extensive paper record-keeping system available on their website that allows for grazing records to be kept for each of the different groups, and then also for the ration of each group being fed. And then the ration change records are included right in with this. And then it also includes, on the last page, a section where you can take each of the different rations fed during the grazing season and do the day-weighted average of the average amount of dry matter coming from pasture over the whole grazing season. And this system is really nice for farmers who don't want to use a computer for doing these records, but do want to be guided through the calculation and record-keeping process for these pasture records. There's also a good system that is a computer program, Excel spreadsheet system that's provided by Organic Valley to their producers for people who want to do a computer system. And I just want to emphasize that it's not necessary to create overly complicated records, and you're much more likely to want to continue to keep your records and do a good job of keeping them up to date if they are as simple as possible while still capturing the information that you need for your own management and for your certifier. And so this is an example of a grazing and feeding record for a group of bred heifers, where instead of keeping the records in a really complicated spreadsheet or computer program, the farmer's just written down that there's 18 bred heifers in this group, that they were moved out to pasture on May 3rd, it says which pasture they went to, and that they were receiving 0 supplemental feed at this point. And then it goes on to say that on June 18th, they were moved on to a new pasture and continued to get nothing but pasture. And then on October 10th, they were moved back into the winter feeding area and started feeding the winter ration. So this is a simple way to capture the information to prove that this group of heifers was getting 100% dry matter from pasture during the whole grazing season. So that wraps up the section where we went through a bunch of example records. So again, this module has been just an overview without going into all of the detail in the organic standards, and it's important to make sure you're familiar with the organic standards, and the full organic standards can be found on the USDA NOP website. The organic standards are amended and updated somewhat often, so it's important to pay attention to the online version, which will be the most up-to-date version of the organic standards. This is a list of some of the additional resources which we recommend that you read if you're interested in learning more about the organic standards as they apply to organic dairy farms, and learn more about the certification and the transition process.